I've been married for half a year. Until the divorce preparations are complete, I've decided to treat my husband, David, as if he's invisible. It hurts because I think of him as a person. I'm Emily, 29 years old. David and I were classmates in college, but we hardly knew each other then. However, we hit it off when we ended up sitting next to each other at a reunion 2 years ago. We happily decided to get married. Currently, we're living together in an apartment. David was the second son in his family, and I'm the eldest of 2 sisters, so David agreed to marry into my family, for which I was very grateful. But there's been one problem lately. David has started ignoring me depending on his mood. David has always been more of the quiet type, more of a listener than a talker. He's more on the quiet side, the type who prefers listening. Even in arguments, he prefers silence over shouting. I'm not extremely talkative myself, but I'm more sociable than David. So, our usual conversations involve me initiating and David joining in. Our relationship started to sour about 3 months into the marriage. David made a minor mistake at work and tried to cover it up, but a chatty female coworker discovered it and spread the word. He received a severe warning from his boss. I guess he didn't like the way I tried to comfort him, although I honestly don't remember it well. After all, it was David who made the mistake, and covering it up was the wrong move. A mistake that warrants a severe warning isn't trivial. David tends to be reserved with his words and often avoids mentioning inconvenient truths. Since being silent is an easy way for him to retaliate, and he can't do it at work, I became his target. So, the initial ignoring was a form of David taking out his frustration on me. From my perspective, David suddenly started ignoring me one day, which shocked me and led me to try to appease him. What's wrong? Did you catch a cold? Is your throat sore? Even when I asked if there was a reason he couldn't talk, David ignored me. Dinner's ready. I made your favorite, meatloaf. What do you think? But he ignored all attempts at conversation, even skipping the usual, thanks for the meal. Finally, I couldn't take it and said, did I do something wrong? I'm sorry if I didn't realize. Though I didn't feel I was at fault, I apologized. It's okay. I forgive you since you apologized. David seemed satisfied with his upper hand, while I felt unresolved and frustrated. But I was relieved to be able to talk to him again and accepted it, unintentionally nurturing the ground for his manipulative behavior. I lost my father in a car accident. I'll never forget it. I was a rebellious sophomore in high school. The night before, I had a petty argument with him over things like high cell phone bills and neglecting my studies, which might lead to my cell phone being confiscated. I think it was that kind of issue. I lashed out, calling him awful names like "you're so stupid." "I hate you." That's terrible. Thinking back, I was clearly in the wrong, but I was young. The next morning, I ignored my father and didn't respond to his "I'm off" with a "have a good day." I was still angry at him for not understanding teenage social life. But I never imagined that right after, he would be hit by a car that slid on icy roads. Nor that our argument the night before would be our last conversation. Seeing my father, who would never speak again, lying there cold, I couldn't stop crying. I regretted not apologizing and shook with the thought. My father, who had just been talking normally the day before, was now lying still and cold. I wished I had at least said "have a good day" to him. That's why I hate and fear the idea of being at odds with someone important to me. I'm not a saint, and as a human, I certainly have conflicts. But if we argue at night, I want to make up before going to work in the morning. In the morning, I want to say I'm off with a smile, and I never want to experience such regret and pain again. I don't carry fights over to the next day. Gradually, this became an unwavering rule for me. David, unlike me, doesn't have such trauma. His parents, while somewhat hands-off, are still alive and well, and he's never lost someone close to him. The rule of not carrying fights over to the next day is mine alone. I've told David about my father numerous times, pleading not to continue fights into the next day. But David doesn't mind if the fight lasts several days until his anger subsides. Instead, David learned that no matter how unreasonable he was with me at night, I would apologize and give in the next day. David never gets physically abusive. He doesn't resort to violence but ignores me. When I am ignored, I fuss over David, trying to appease him. Even though I don't think I'm at fault, I become restless and start searching for my own shortcomings, wondering if I said too much or unknowingly hurt him. It was a vicious cycle. Both David and I became numb, and he began ignoring me over trivial matters until he was satisfied. When the ignoring lasts a day or two, I feel a tightness in my chest and start to feel nauseous. I get unstoppable heart palpitations, break into cold sweats, feel dizzy, and my stomach hurts so much that I lose all appetite. At its worst, the ignoring would go on for a week, and I became almost neurotic. "I'm sorry, honey. Please stop ignoring me and forgive me." That kind of apology won't do. It lacks sincerity. I apologize until David is satisfied. I felt strangely as if my mind and body were falling apart. But as long as we're talking, it means I'm not being ignored. David is alive. So, maybe it's okay. I think I was completely irrational. The wake-up call came from my father. His death anniversary was approaching, and my mom contacted me about holding his 13th memorial service. It was meant to be a family-only event, but since David married into my family, my mom invited us both. By that time, David had turned into a complete tyrant and stopped paying any attention to me. That's a hassle. He died a long time ago, and I never met your dad, so it's none of my business. You should go alone. Okay. I agreed readily, not wanting to anger David. David only ignores me and doesn't physically abuse me, so I thought enduring it would make things work. When I arrived at my parents' house alone, my sister, Mia, was shocked at my appearance. "You look way too thin, Emily. It's not a diet, is it?" she exclaimed with a worried look. My mom was also surprised, asking, "What happened? Doesn't David say anything?" Feeling grateful for my mother and sister's concern and empathy, I couldn't help but cry. I hadn't realized I had lost so much weight until they pointed it out, and even my morning clothes felt loose. David hadn't said anything either. As I slowly shared my situation, my mom and Mia were furious. "I can't believe it. How could he do the very thing Emily hates the most? Knowing how traumatized you are about your dad. His treatment is downright cruel. If you're going to divorce, now's the time while you don't have kids." Hearing them speak on my behalf, I felt the wounds David had inflicted on my heart begin to heal. If Dad knew what you were going through, he'd be furious. And I'm not okay with it either. I'll never forgive my brother-in-law. But he never hits or kicks me, I instinctively defended David. "Emotional abuse is still abuse," my mom firmly countered. "The fight you had with Dad that night and David's ignoring are completely different. David's behavior is one-sided domestic violence. You don't have to endure it." After the memorial service ended, we spent quality time as a family, sharing memories. We laughed and cried while looking through old family albums. I realized how much my family loved me. "Emily, you've been pushing yourself too hard. You can always come back. Your room is still here." "Yeah. Emily, you should divorce him, really." After being repeatedly advised to divorce, I've completely leaned towards the idea of divorcing. I realized there was no need to endure it. Yeah, that's right. I was so foolish to keep appeasing someone who doesn't care about me and to blindly agree to everything. I'm going to divorce David. I began to move towards divorce. If we're going to divorce anyway, it's as if he's not there. Then he's just like air. It's painful because I think of him as a person, so I should just think of him as invisible. It was a change in perspective, or maybe I just came to terms with it. Then, one day after a while, he started ignoring me again, but being ignored became the norm, and I just thought of it as another one of his tantrums. I stopped trying to please David. At first, David seemed confused, and as if testing the waters, he said, "Hey, bring me some tea." While I was watching TV in the living room, I ignored him. "Hey. Can't you hear? I said tea, bring me tea." I silently turned up the volume on the TV. "Can't you hear me? I'm asking for tea." David raised his voice in irritation. Then, for the first time, I glanced at David with cold eyes. "Can you keep it down? Huh? My response was not what David expected, and he looked as if he had been hit by a shock. He probably thought a little yelling would make me obey. I went back to focusing on the TV, completely ignoring David. Realizing my attitude was different from before, a flustered David started to show concern. "Hey, what's wrong with you? Are you feeling unwell or something? How ridiculous. He's getting all worked up over this level of ignoring." I was ignored by David for an entire week. Worried now? To a panicking David, I said, "It's too late now." David left the living room without saying anything. Then something strange happened. David started to show concern for me. "Hey, I bought some cake." Probably trying to appease me, David began bringing home little gifts. But it was just convenience store sweets, though. "Thank you." I maintained basic politeness as a person. But that was it. I stored it in the fridge and ate it when David wasn't around. I didn't have tea and cake with him. I continued to serve meals as before, but without saying anything. Previously, I would say, "Dinner's ready," but I stopped doing that. Then, surprisingly, David started initiating conversation like, "Thanks for the meal," and "Oh, this is delicious." Each time he spoke to me, I would glance at him but remain silent. Then, a few days later, David came up to me with a bashful face and a bouquet of flowers. "Here, take this." It wasn't my birthday or anything, but maybe he thought giving me flowers would cheer me up. "It's too late for that, though." I glanced at David. "Thank you," I said, accepting the flowers. "Hey. Don't you have anything else to say?" David panicked, but I just shrugged and left him alone. A few more days passed, and as the divorce preparations were finalized, I said to David, "Would you like some tea?" David smiled happily. "Wow. That's thoughtful of you." "Thanks." He eagerly sat down at the table. Along with the tea, I quietly put our wedding ring. David's face changed color instantly. "What's this? Don't you know? Remember how you treated me like I was invisible, ignoring me? I thought I'd fulfill your wish by not being here." "I'm sorry." David kneeled down right there. Surprisingly, his apology didn't touch my heart at all. "You know, it's too late now. I was wrong. I won't ignore you anymore. Forgive me. I love you." David was rubbing his head against the carpet, apologizing sincerely. Perhaps he was genuinely remorseful. But it was too late. I had pleaded with David countless times. I told him about my father, how I hated being ignored. But he chose not to listen. "You must understand now. The pain of being ignored." Even so, I maintained the bare minimum of conversation and did the household chores. "You did nothing." Ignoring someone means showing contempt and dislike through behavior. How can I believe someone who says they love me and asks for forgiveness, after treating me like that? Why would you still think I could love you? David collapsed in tears, but I ignored him. Even though I don't love him anymore, there's a slight sense of guilt in ignoring someone who is crying. David is the kind of man who can ignore someone just because he's in a bad mood. If I forgive him now, he'll surely ignore me again. Why? I didn't do anything that bad. It's just not talking for a bit. You're overreacting. David pleaded while crying, but I was horrified. Clearly, to David, ignoring his wife for a week was not a big deal. I'm glad I decided to divorce. Our values were too different, and we would have divorced sooner or later. Better sooner than later. I'm done being hurt depending on my husband's mood without understanding why. From now on, I won't talk to you directly. For property division and other details, please communicate through a lawyer. Oh. And I'll be claiming alimony, so take care of that. With those words, David finally realized I was serious. Too late, and he probably still doesn't understand how much his ignoring can hurt someone. But since we're getting divorced and becoming strangers, I'll ignore him. With tears and snot all over his face, David agreed divorce. Thus, I successfully divorced David, who used to ignore me. Thanks to the lawyer, the property division was settled, and the alimony was properly paid. He reverted to his maiden name as we divorced. The The chatty female coworker will probably have something to say, but that's his problem. I've returned to my parents' house, realizing the importance of conversation.